Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and assume that it has done what it's supposed to do. I guess the only real downside that I've come up with so far to this whole screen sharing setup is that I cannot quite tell whether or not everything's working as well as it's supposed to. Of course, experience has taught us that even when I could see everything, I couldn't necessarily tell if everything was working the way that it was supposed to. So that may not be all of that new. I'm glad that you are here with us for. I know the slide says week 3, but I definitely just messed that up. This is, in fact, our 4th week of our study in the Gospel of Matthew. Oh, and now my phone is talking to me. I turned it on so I could see what was going on. There we go. So, I know the slide says week 3. I know this is, in fact, week 4. I just got a little mixed up whenever I was typing it all out earlier and ended up off by a week. Not a big deal. We are continuing our study in the Gospel of Matthew. We've looked so far at the first chapter, gave you the first week an introduction, and the last 2 weeks we've looked at chapter 1. First the genealogy, and then Jesus' birth. And now we get into study, or not study. We get into some stories that involve people outside Jesus' immediate family. And one of the things that I pointed out during the intro and have revisited weeks 2 and 3, and we'll show back up again today, is I want you paying attention throughout the Gospel of Matthew at how non-Jewish people show up in the story and are portrayed. You know that relationships between Jews and Gentiles, especially in Judea, close to Jerusalem, were not great. Some stories that we get in Acts about how Peter interacted or didn't interact with people who were different than him, depending on where he was at, kind of tells us a little bit of that. But one of the things that is unique, and I think important in Matthew's gospel, is the way in which outsiders, non-central people, end up getting better treatment and play a more prominent role, whether that be women or Gentiles or people who are struggling to believe. So I want you looking for that as we work our way through. So chapter 2 tonight is what we're going to look at. Here in a bit, we're going to read through a good portion of the chapter itself. But I want to start by introducing you to Herod the Great and giving you some background information on him. He is named Herod the Great not because he was some great guy, but because he was the first. And there were some things that he was truly great at, and we'll discuss those here as we go. But, Herod's not a terribly laudable individual. He's not somebody you want your kids to grow up and be like. Jewish historian Josephus writes, less than a century after Herod's death, roughly a century after Herod's death, and he's a Jewish historian, really writing specifically to a Roman audience, so he twists and shades some things in a particular direction to fit his audience. But one of the things I want to share a quote that Josephus wrote about Herod. I made sure I copied this down when I was reading Josephus yesterday, because this is as good a description of Herod as I have seen. A man he was of great barbarity towards all men equally, and a slave to his passions, but above the consideration of what was right. Yet he was favored by fortune as much as any man ever was, for from a private man he became a king, and though he were encompassed with 10,000 dangers, he got clear of them all and continued life to a very old age. That's a very quick paragraph on that Josephus gave us on Herod. Another one that I like, shorter, but every bit as colorful. He was racially Arab, religiously Jewish, culturally Greek, and politically Roman. He was a Renaissance man, 1,500, 1,600 years before the Renaissance. Sorry, those are two fantastic quotes on Josephus, on Herod from Josephus, and then one from a more modern historian. Herod was from ancient Edom. Idumea is what it would have been called under Roman rule. Before his birth, his father and plenty of others were converted. Whether it was forcibly or by choice is a little bit up in the air. But his father works his way into a prominent role in Jewish leadership about 100 years before Jesus was born. And then Herod sort of continues that family tradition. Not quite 100 years before Jesus was born, but just to give you a ballpark. So Herod actually ends up being the governor of Galilee by the time he's 25. And he was known early on for his successes in kind of keeping some bandits and brigands in the area in check. Galilee was kind of a bywater area nearby some major international travel roads. So the area itself was not all that important, but there were some roads that passed through there that were ripe for the picking as far as some area thieves were concerned, and Herod did a lot of good work keeping that in check. Herod's standing becomes rather tenuous when his father is assassinated. And I don't want to get into everything that Herod did in order to pull off what he pulled off, because when your dad's assassinated, you can go ahead and assume that they want your head too. But Herod, 3 years after his dad's assassination, is crowned King of the Jews. That's an actual title. King of Judea. By the emperor in Rome, and then travels back and spends some time getting everything under control. And he makes some tribute promises, how much he's going to pay to help secure him this role. And then he gains that money by stripping it from the people who had opposed him, and leaving alone the people, anybody else. So he builds some internal support doing that. He's known for his building projects. Entire cities come into existence under Herod's reign. The temple is massively expanded. He pushes the temple complex itself to 33 acres in size. So the size of the physical temple doesn't change, but the temple courts in the area itself become huge. There are some structures still present in Jerusalem today that were built during Herod's reign. And then a huge part of Jesus' young life would have been the building of the city of Sepphoris, which was just a couple of miles away from Nazareth. And we always talk about Jesus as a carpenter and Joseph as a carpenter. But the biblical word that we've translated carpenter is more craftsman. So he very well could have been capable with working with materials other than just wood. Likely would have been talented as a stonemason, and would have participated in the building of a city like Sepphoris, because it's only a couple of miles away, and lots of employment would have been available. Jesus himself may have worked as a craftsman in Sepphoris during his early years. One of the things that we know about Herod is he became more and more paranoid the longer he reigned. So early on, a lot of his focus was to people outside, but once he kind of had the region pacified, he became more and more concerned about potential rivals from inside his own family and his wife's family. He's married to his first wife, who was the daughter of the previous king. And so she has some family claim to the throne. Her kids have some potential family claim. They're popular. And so along the way, he puts to death a wife, at least 3 sons, several other relatives. Some of those threats were real. Some of those threats were imagined. But Herod's solution to any potential threat was kill him. And he does a lot of it. And he ends up in trouble a lot with the Roman leadership. And man, that dude finds a way out of it every single time. So really, really good at making some political maneuvers. He even survives being on the wrong side of a battle between two potential emperors at one point. And the fact that he could stand against the future emperor and then come away okay is pretty impressive. And then Caesar Augustus has a quote on Herod that's just top notch, and he used some wordplay, and I gave you the similar sounding words so you could get it. I'm not putting the whole sentence up there, but he said half jokingly that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, which tells you a little bit about what his family relationship was like and a little bit about the man himself. So all of that is good background, quick, but good background to understand that when the wise men, terrible translation, I wrote it, but when the Magi show up in Matthew 2 looking for the newborn king of the Jews, and they go straight away to the palace because where else would you go and ask about him? Herod is not responding, hopefully or graciously. He responds very craftily, very cunning. And so, especially towards the end of his life, like when the Magi show up, he either is about to or just has executed two of his sons, depending on where we are in the timeline. Like he's descending into madness. And so, like if there was ever a moment for we have no idea how many of them. 3 gifts doesn't ever say 3 wise men. But if there were ever a bad time for these guys to show up, this would have been it. And of course his reaction makes that very obvious. So I'm going to start by reading the first half of chapter 2 and take a look at the text and then do a little more digging after that. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea, during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is this newborn king of the Jews? We've come to see his star in the east, and we've come to honor him." When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, which is very, very generous translation. And everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. That doesn't mean they were on his side, but as you can imagine, somebody with Herod's level of instability could cause some problems if he feels that there is an imminent rival. He gathered all of the chief priests and the legal experts and asked them where the Christ was to be born. And they said, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote. You, Bethlehem, land of Judah, by no means are you the least among the rulers of Judah, because from you will come one who governs, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them what time the star had first appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you found him, report to me so that I may go and honor him." When they heard the king, they went, and look, the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. Then they entered the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother. Falling to their knees, they honored him. Then they opened their treasure chests and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back to their own country by another route. All right, so who were the Magi? Because these are some guys that we basically never talk about. They show up in the Christmas story every year, and then there's no more discussion. And we also, typically as churches, have danced around this conversation because it looks like they successfully use astrology to find Jesus, which for a number of people causes some extra question marks and red flags to pop up. Like, what do we do with that? So there are a few things that I would like to point out. One, the Old Testament has a couple of moments in it where things like astrology show up and are kind of an accepted part of the life of the people. Certainly early Judaism around the time of Jesus has some affinity for astrology, and it's not surprising that people would have been looking to the stars. Even Jewish people who believed in God, I mean, these are people who have a history of being led by signs and by miracles and by dreams and visions. So why not? Now, again, I know that's not necessarily one of our standard answers, but it's not terribly surprising that it shows up in the story. And then the other question, if you accept that they successfully followed a star to get there, is what was it? Is God just creating a star that is, specific to this purpose? Was there some other sign that went along with it? Or was this just a natural phenomenon that they followed and stumbled into what was going on? They obviously brought gifts, but they didn't necessarily know who they were bringing gifts to. Gold, frankincense, or myrrh are strange gifts for a baby. I mean, it's not a rattle, and it's not a box of diapers, and it's not a gift card to, I guess Toys R Us is out, Target. A little bit different than what we do gifts-wise for babies. There's actually, this is a total aside, but this is kind of fun. I don't know that there's supposed to be any meaning there. But one of the things that was pointed out by a couple of scholars in the reading that I did was that gold, frankincense, and myrrh are three very interesting choices, especially for Jesus. Because gold is the gift of kings, was considered such then, and certainly still today. Frankincense was used in sacrificial practices and for purity, like in the temple in Jerusalem. And then myrrh is a perfume that's used when, especially when taking care of bodies at the end of life. And so if you want to read into those gifts, even the gifts themselves speak towards the direction that Jesus is heading, the path that his life is going to take. Of course, they're also three very valuable gifts, the type of gifts that you would just give a king. So maybe you don't have to read into them for them to just be cool. We also don't know where they came from. My guess is Babylon. The same word used to describe them in Matthew is used in Daniel to describe some Babylonian Magi, chapter 2, I think. Given Israel's history with Babylon, there's a large Jewish community in Babylon. There are some Babylonian leaders in the time of, from the 5th century on, because the 5th century BCE on, because of the large population of Jewish people who are there, who take an interest in Jewish stories, Jewish history, Jewish prophecy. And then the other thing that I would point out is that Egypt, Babylon, Israel's history in general is an important point of reflection throughout Matthew's gospel. To me, it just makes sense that the people of Babylon would likely play a part in this story, just like Egypt plays a part in this story. You see here, potential map. This map line, as it's drawn out, follows the major travel road in the ancient world that would have gone from beyond Babylon to past Egypt. And so here's your likely map, 900 miles worth of travel, kind of sprawled out. There are some other options that bring it even further. So again, not telling you that they were from any of these specific areas, but depending on how far east you want to go, the wise men very easily could have come from further. Because we don't get a whole lot of further description of them. Their actual nationality is not named. All we have are guesses, but I came across these two maps that kind of gave us an idea a little bit of, kind of especially in our modern world, where they might have come from. So there, I hope that's enjoyable, I don't know is the right word, but I hope that builds out some information a little bit for you. So yeah, the other thing that I want to talk about is those astrological signs that might have caught their attention. The one that most people would point to as far as occurring during that time period that would have definitely caught an ancient astrologer's attention would have been the slow convergence of Saturn and Jupiter in the sky. Massively bright star, and something that I think only happens once every 800-ish years. And that took place about the time that Jesus was born, around the year 7 or 6 BCE. You also have Halley's Comet, which makes a very close pass in years 11 or 10. And then another comet, Chinese comet, Nova comet, depending on how you name it, passes by in 5-4, somewhere in that area. Herod dies in 4 BCE, and so Jesus is born somewhere between 9 and as late as 4, somewhere in that window. You may be surprised to see that it's not attached to year 0, but we didn't start with this BC AD dating, or now BC CE, before Common Era and Common Era, until about the 7th century. So the fact that the dude missed by like 5 or 6 years is actually pretty impressive. Because there are moments when I look at my children and I feel like I'm missing by 5 or 6 years, and I'm not looking back 700. So kudos to the guy for getting that close. Now as we dig in more to the history, as we found more documentation and more information, we can kind of do a little bit better job of pinpointing it. So yeah, just a little piece of information. All right, continuing on reading. When the Magi had departed, an angel from the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod will soon search for the child in order to kill him." Joseph got up during the night, took the child and his mother, and went to Egypt. Joseph doesn't wait until the next day. Like, I absolutely love that. Because even the word from God tells him there's a little bit of wiggle room. Like, he could get some sleep. Herod will soon search for the child in order to kill him. And Joseph's like, nope, we're not messing around with this Herod guy. That dude's nuts. He stayed there until Herod died. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. "I have called my son out of Egypt." So when Herod knew the Magi had fooled him, he grew very angry. He sent soldiers to kill all the children in Bethlehem and in the surrounding territory who were 2 years old and younger, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. This fulfilled the word spoken through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and much grieving, Rachel weeping for her children. She did not want to be comforted because they were no more. After King Herod died, an angel from the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. "Get up," the angel said, "and take the child and his mother and go back to the land of Israel. Those who were trying to kill the child are dead." So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus ruled over Judea in the place of Herod, Joseph was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he went to the area of Galilee. He settled in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. All right. So again, I talked about this the last few weeks. Matthew does a lot of reaching back to the Old Testament to provide some information, some framework for understanding Jesus. And so we get several references in the passage that we just read, in all of this passage. And I want to remind you that when Matthew says fulfilled, he's not using that word in a way like that we would often view it. I don't think that Matthew views these prophecies as about Jesus, because Matthew's a smart guy and recognizes they had an original context and an original people that they meant something to. Instead, I think what we have here, again, are ways in which that Matthew is using Israel's history, Israel's story, the story of the people, which is an incredibly important thing to the Jewish community, and saying, here are the ways in which Jesus is like the embodiment and the personification of our people, our story, our heritage, and our relationship with God. So the passages that Matthew quotes from there from Isaiah and Hosea are very obviously about something else in their original context. They are about Israel. They're about the people, the nation. And so, like, Matthew uses these quotes, these, prophecies, these words from the prophet that are about Israel, about the people as a whole, and says essentially Jesus is the ultimate conclusion of all of these things. Jesus can best, and I think that's how I ended last week, Jesus can best be understood in light of God's ongoing work. And then there's a reference to Jesus having to be called a Nazarene from the Old Testament prophets. And this is a bit of a problem, a conundrum, because there is no passage in the Old Testament that mentions Nazareth at all. Like, not there. Therefore, there's no word of a prophet that we have in our Bible that says that any future Messiah has to be called or will be called a Nazarene. Like, it's not there. So when Matthew is pointing us back to something here, we don't currently have what he's pointing us back to. There are a couple of options here as to what he might mean. And there's one that I think is most likely, although neither of them would be terribly surprising, or some other option that I'm just completely overlooking. One is that there's a possibility that he's referencing some sort of tradition, textual or oral, that hasn't survived. It didn't get written down, it didn't get passed on, or it did get written down and the manuscripts got destroyed. I don't know if there's like a Third Chronicles out there that we don't have now that they had access to somehow then. That doesn't seem as likely to me, but it's certainly a possibility. An oral tradition makes that more possible than otherwise. Or, and this is the one that I like, Matthew's giving us a word play. This wouldn't be the only time that he does this, and he's already shown ways in which he's using Old Testament story and prophecy to build a bigger picture. And wordplay is certainly like a public speaking mechanism that catches people's attention. And so here's how that would work here. The root of the word in Nazarene and the word for branch sound basically the same. Nasir and Nazir. And the prophecy we have in Isaiah 11, one that Matthew is well aware of, talks about a branch from the stump of Jesse. So I think there's a good chance that Matthew is trying to, I don't know if make up for is the right word, but explain why the prophet, the Messiah, would have come from Nazareth. Because you got to remember, like John gives us the story where an early disciple who's being said, hey, I think I found the Messiah, and the response that he gives is, can anything good come from Nazareth? So Matthew is left, kind of holding the bag and trying to explain how somebody good came from Nazareth, how something good came from Nazareth. And so a little bit of wordplay certainly accomplishes that. And while it may not seem particularly catchy to us, it certainly holds more sway in ancient Israel. So again, if you're looking for an actual prophecy in the Old Testament that talks about a Messiah coming from Nazareth, it's not there. If you're looking for Matthew trying to have a little fun with some wordplay and explain why it's okay that Jesus spent time in Nazareth as a kid, then there's as possible an option as any. And then lastly, because my computer is about to die, and I apologize if it gives out, mid-sentence here in a minute, we get some more images where Jesus and Moses show similarities. Moses being the preeminent figure in all of Jewish history. He is the most important figure in the story of the people. And so for Matthew to look at Jesus and point to Moses and say, yeah, these guys are in the same boat, and then build Jesus up from there. He's starting by putting them in the same neighborhood, and then we'll build Jesus up from there. That's a big deal in Jewish tradition. Again, may not catch us quite as much, but for Matthew's audience, it's a very big deal. So we get Egypt's involvement. Moses has to be protected as a child because Hebrew babies are being killed by the Pharaoh. Jesus has to be protected as a child because Bethlehem's babies are being killed by Herod. Later on in his young adulthood, Moses has to flee away from Egypt because people are trying to kill him. Jesus, Joseph, Mary flee to Egypt because people are trying to kill him. The instructions that Moses receives are nearly word for word the same as what Joseph, Jesus, Mary family receives whenever it's time to return. Those who were trying to kill you, those who were trying to kill Jesus, are dead. You can go home. So again, we see those storylines showing some similarities. And there are all sorts of things from Jesus' early life, childhood, that Matthew could talk about. He leaves some stuff out from Luke's gospel, doesn't include it because it's not important to him. He includes some stuff that is important to the point that he's trying to make. And these things all kind of help build Jesus up as a like this but greater, which is so much of what Matthew does, pointing back to the Old Testament. Like Moses but greater, like Israel but greater, like the story of us and God come to life in front of us. So there we go. All right. I think, oh no, the one other point that I was going to make that I forgot. Gentiles. In this story, the non-Jewish Eastern Magi are the ones who come off looking really good. They're the ones who hear of the coming Messiah and travel a long way to find him. Herod and all of those in Jerusalem stirred up by it couldn't manage the 6 miles to Bethlehem. They may have been concerned, but they weren't that invested. So again, you see greater acts of faith coming from outside the community than inside in this story. And so again, we are seeing Matthew celebrate some Gentiles, some outsiders, and not so much the people who you would have expected would get it. And I think that's just another way in which Matthew is very early on in the story saying, remember, Jesus is doing something here that's beyond, that goes beyond the edges of our community, our historic community. And that's important because Matthew is Matthew's writing to a community that's made up of Jews and Gentiles, who's navigating some of those challenges. And, we see again in the Gospel of Acts, or in this book of Acts, and in some of Paul's writings, how those conflicts continue on through the early years of the church. And so Matthew is trying to bolster unity in the face of some of the division that very well could be there by pointing back to even the first people who worship Jesus. My translation chose honored, but the real idea there is that they worshiped him. The first people who worship Jesus in the story of Jesus' life, as far as Matthew records, are Gentiles, Magi from the east, who got there because they followed the stars. They didn't have anything else to point them to Jesus, so they followed what they had. All right. Glad you were with us tonight. As always, if you have any questions, comments, you can type them into the comment side of the video. You can text me, call me, email me. I really love kind of the history and background. The fact that Herod's the guy on the throne when Jesus is born is just, the icing on the cake for a guy who was so concerned that something was going to get him, that somebody was going to dethrone him, and the Messiah is born during his reign is just, it's humorous. Don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor. All right. Again, glad you were with us tonight. And we will be back and take another crack at this next week with chapter 3, in the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. All right, y'all have a good one.